They say curiosity can lead you down dangerous paths. I never used to believe that, at least not until that night. It started as a casual gathering, just my husband and a few of his closest friends, hanging out like we had many times before. The mood was relaxed, easy laughter filling the room as stories were shared, drinks in hand, just like any other evening. I was there with them, listening, laughing along, feeling part of the moment without thinking much of it. But looking back, I realized the energy in the room felt a little different. The air was charged with something I hadn't noticed before, something that started to shift from laughter and lightness to an unspoken tension. Small glances lingered a bit too long, compliments had an edge to them, and I felt a strange new awareness in the room, a heightened feeling that I couldn't explain. My husband's friends seemed unusually attentive to me that night. And even more strangely, my husband didn't seem to mind. As the night wore on, the friendly banter began to take on a different tone. My husband's friends started joking around in a way that felt more suggestive. I caught a few of them glancing at me, and instead of calling them out or shifting the conversation back to a safe place, my husband leaned back with an almost knowing smile, looking relaxed as he watched the exchange. By then, I could feel my heart racing a little faster, the buzz of excitement mingling with disbelief. It was all still just jokes, harmless fun, or so I kept telling myself. But when my husband gave a slight nod of encouragement, everything shifted in my mind, and I realized this was more than a friendly evening among friends. I felt caught between curiosity and caution, unsure if this was something I wanted, something I could brush off, or if it was the start of something I'd never be able to forget. I remember the first time I met my husband's friends, back when we were dating. They were a lively, easygoing group, full of laughs and good-natured jokes. My husband was so proud to introduce me, almost like he was presenting a part of himself to them. And I could tell he wanted their approval, which made me feel special, like being with me meant something to him, too. Over the years, I had come to see them as friends as well. We shared countless evenings together, dinners, gatherings, barbecues. Each time, I laughed, joined in on the banter, and found it easy to relax around them. They treated me like one of the guys in a way. Looking back, there wasn't a single moment when I could have predicted how things would shift. They were just his friends, his close friends, but always my friends too. Or so I thought. As time went on, I started noticing subtle changes in how my husband's friends interacted with me. The harmless teasing and playful comments, which had always been part of the group's dynamic, started to feel a little different. The way they looked at me lingered just a moment longer, and the compliments seemed more deliberate. It was as if they were pushing invisible boundaries to see how far they could go. My husband noticed, too. But instead of feeling uncomfortable, he'd just chuckle, nudging them on. "You're too easy to rile up," he'd say, winking at me. And I'd laugh along, even though something inside me felt slightly off. Part of me wondered if I was imagining things, reading into the situation more than I should. After all, they were his closest friends, guys he'd known for years. But the feeling was hard to shake. Each time we'd get together, there'd be a moment, a lingering glance, a comment that would hang in the air a beat too long. And as much as I tried to ignore it, it was undeniably there. An undercurrent of excitement, maybe, or something I didn't want to name. One night, a small gathering at our house marked the start of something neither of us would ever forget. We had some friends over, the usual group, and after a few drinks, someone suggested a game of truth or dare. It seemed innocent enough at first. The dares were harmless, silly even, just things like doing impressions of each other or making a ridiculous phone call. We all laughed, feeling that easy sense of familiarity. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. The dares took on a different flavor, nothing blatant, but suggestive enough to make me sit up and notice. When it was my turn, one of my husband's friends dared me to tell them about my most embarrassing date. I brushed it off with a laugh, but he insisted, his eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. So I played along, telling a light-hearted story that got them all laughing, though I was keenly aware of the attention on me. Every time I finished a sentence, they'd look at each other knowingly, as if they'd read into things that weren't there. I looked to my husband, expecting him to step in, maybe even change the subject. But instead, He just watched with that familiar, amused smile. As the game continued, the dares got bolder, the laughter deeper, and the air heavier. I told myself it was just the alcohol lowering inhibitions, making everyone a bit more open, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Boundaries were starting to blur, and I wasn't sure where it would all lead. The next few times we all gathered, the playful, teasing nature of the group felt heightened. Every glance seemed to carry a meaning, every joke an unspoken question. When one of my husband's friends laughed a little too hard at one of my jokes or looked a little too intently during a conversation, I could feel a shift. The lines between casual and intimate were becoming blurred. And strangely, my husband seemed to find it amusing. Then, one afternoon, it happened again. The group was over, and as I was setting out snacks, one of my husband's friends offered to help in the kitchen. He was always the quieter one, usually keeping a bit of distance. But this time, his hand brushed against mine, lingering longer than it should have. I could feel my heart race just a little, aware of him in a way I hadn't been before. I froze for a second, the air between us thick with a tension I hadn't anticipated. But before I could pull my hand back, he moved away casually, leaving me feeling oddly exposed, as if something in the room had shifted, but no one else had noticed. It felt like a warning, and as I returned to the living room, I tried to brush it off, but that lingering feeling stayed with me all evening. After that night, I noticed things felt different. It wasn't anything obvious, but there was a change. When we'd have them over, there was an awareness in the room, an unspoken tension, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. My husband's friends would glance at me a bit longer than they used to, but now there was something unmistakable in their expressions. And my husband never said a word to stop it. If anything, he encouraged it, brushing it off like it was all harmless fun. One evening, we were sitting together in the living room when he brought it up directly. "You've noticed, haven't you?" he asked casually, as if talking about the weather. I felt a rush of nerves, not sure what he meant. "Noticed what?" I asked, trying to play it off. He just chuckled, a knowing look in his eyes. "The way they look at you," he said. "You can feel it too, right?" His words hung in the air, and I could only nod, unsure of what to say. He smiled, leaning back, his expression unreadable. And for the first time, I realized he knew exactly what was going on, and he was willing to let it happen. As the weeks went by, that charged undercurrent between us and my husband's friends only intensified. It was no longer just a casual gathering when they came over. It felt like an event. I would feel their eyes on me as I moved around the room, setting out drinks or tidying up, and I knew they were watching, feeling the same tension that had started to define every interaction. One night, the tension became nearly impossible to ignore. We were gathered for a casual dinner at our place, with my husband leading the conversation, his laugh easy and comfortable. But there was something in his smile, a glint in his eye, that made me wonder if he was aware of just how much attention I was receiving. After dinner, the group migrated to the living room. As everyone settled in, I found myself sitting between my husband and one of his closest friends. Conversation drifted around us, but I felt a new, palpable energy radiating from the friend sitting beside me. He shifted closer, leaning in when he spoke, his hand resting on the back of the couch just behind me. And then, casually, his hand brushed my shoulder as he laughed at something my husband said. The touch was so light, it could have been accidental, but it lingered just a moment longer than necessary. I glanced at my husband, half expecting him to react, to break the tension with a laugh or even a scolding remark. But instead, he just sat back with a slight smile, watching the scene unfold. That night was a turning point, one of those moments where nothing is said out loud, but everything is understood. When his friends left, the atmosphere between my husband and me was charged. He turned to me with an intense look, and for a moment, it felt like he was on the verge of saying something important, something that might explain everything. But he just gave me a lingering kiss, his eyes dark with something I couldn't place, and then walked upstairs without a word. I stayed behind, trying to make sense of it all. That silent understanding between us had become so profound that I no longer knew where the lines were. All I knew was that whatever we had unleashed between us and his friends, it wasn't going away. Over the next few days, I replayed that night in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than I understood. And yet, my husband seemed perfectly fine with the shift, acting as though the boundaries we'd tiptoed around for so long were simply natural. He treated me the same as ever, loving and attentive, but there was a new edge in our interactions. It was like he enjoyed seeing me in this strange, uncharted space with his friends, though he never said as much. The next time they all came over, the evening quickly took on a similar tone. We'd barely finished eating when one of my husband's friends suggested we play a game. It was just like old times, but with that added layer of intensity simmering beneath the surface. The dares escalated quickly, almost as if everyone was daring someone else to break the invisible barrier once and for all. At one point, I felt one of his friends' hand brush against mine in what should have been a friendly gesture, but felt like something more. I looked at him, startled, but he just smiled, his expression holding a quiet, knowing challenge. And there was my husband again, watching with that same smile, seeming almost amused. He could have stopped it at any time, could have drawn a clear line in the sand. But he didn't. And I realized he didn't want to. That night, I found myself at the center of attention, caught in a whirlwind of flirtation and glances. As the hours passed, boundaries continued to blur. Every word, every touch, felt heavier, more loaded, as if we were all playing some unspoken game with stakes none of us wanted to admit. Then came the night that changed everything, the night that all the subtle looks and touches and glances came to a head. It started like any other evening with the group, casual drinks, light-hearted conversation, laughter filling the air. But there was an intensity in the room that hadn't been there before. Everyone seemed keenly aware that tonight was different. At some point, my husband's hand found mine. He leaned over, close to my ear, and whispered, "I know what's been going on. I'm okay with it, you know." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" He just smiled. "I mean, I know." He glanced at his friends, his smile widening slightly. "If you're interested, I wouldn't mind." My heart pounded in my chest as his words sank in. This wasn't just a flirtation anymore. This was real. He was giving permission to go beyond what had once been unspeakable. The tension in the room was electric as he let go of my hand, leaning back and nodding slightly as if to say, "Go ahead." It was thrilling and terrifying all at once, and as the evening wore on, that invisible boundary we'd danced around for so long finally dissolved completely. In the days after that night, everything felt different. The interactions between us all had changed irrevocably. I could sense it in the way his friends looked at me, in the way my husband watched. A new, unspoken understanding now lay between us. There was no going back to how things were before. Our gatherings continued, but they carried an intensity that none of us acknowledged aloud. Even in those everyday moments, catching a glimpse of one of them watching me, feeling my husband's approving smile in the background, the boundaries between us all had dissolved, leaving us in a complex, uncharted space. At home, my husband and I tried to talk about what had happened, but neither of us seemed to know where to begin. Our relationship felt changed, our trust redefined. I could see in his eyes that he didn't regret it, that he enjoyed this strange new connection as much as I did, even if it came with its own set of complexities. As time went on, that night remained a turning point, shaping the dynamics between us and his friends in ways I hadn't anticipated. What had once been casual and easy now felt heavy with unspoken emotions and unresolved tensions. It was clear that we'd crossed lines that could never be uncrossed, and the reality of that choice lingered between us all. The gatherings grew fewer and farther between. His friends began to drift away, each of us silently acknowledging that things could never be the same. What had once been a carefree camaraderie had evolved into something too complex, too layered with meaning. At home, my husband and I adjusted to this new normal, though the memory of that night lingered. We'd chosen a path that few would understand, and though it had brought us closer in some ways, it had also introduced a kind of distance neither of us could fully explain. Looking back, I realized that night was the start of something we'd both needed, but hadn't known how to articulate. It was a test, perhaps, of boundaries and trust, a moment where curiosity had led us to something wild and unforgettable. The thrill of it stayed with us, a memory that neither of us wanted to forget even as we moved forward, changed by the experience. In the end, we had discovered something about each other, something deep and complex. Though the events of that night remained unspoken between us and his friends, it had marked a shift that shaped the course of our lives. We continued, each of us carrying the memory of that wild night, bound by the choices we'd made and the lessons we'd learned in the process. That night left its mark on all of us. It wasn't just about what happened. It was the impact it had on our relationships, on my marriage, and on the friendships that once seemed untouchable. We all tried to return to our routines, our regular gatherings, our usual banter, but the air was always thick with the memory of that night. The next time my husband's friends came over, things felt different, more cautious. We exchanged smiles and laughs as we always did, but each one of us seemed aware of the shift. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was a weight to it, a reminder of the boundaries we'd crossed. My husband kept an eye on things, attentive but relaxed, as though he was as curious as I was to see what happened next. But this time, the energy didn't build like it had before. Instead, everyone seemed content to keep things light, to maintain a sense of normalcy. Despite that, I could feel a new awareness between me and each of his friends. Glances lingered a little longer than they should have. A hand brushed my arm casually, but intentionally. Even my husband's gaze held a knowing look that hadn't been there before, as if he relished the idea that we were all still walking along the edge. That evening, after they left, my husband turned to me, his eyes studying me thoughtfully. "So, what do you think about where things stand now?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I think we're all just trying to adjust," I admitted. "It feels different, but maybe that's not a bad thing." He nodded, a faint smile on his face. "Maybe we all needed a shake-up," he said, pulling me close. "Either way, I don't regret it." Hearing those words gave me a sense of peace. We weren't just pushing boundaries for the thrill. We were discovering something deeper about ourselves, about each other. It was as if we'd both been looking for something to test the strength of our relationship, and, in a way, we'd found it. Over the next several months, things started to settle. My husband's friends continued to visit, but the tension that had once filled the room began to ease. We returned to casual get-togethers, the kind that didn't carry the weight of that unforgettable night. I sensed we had all accepted that some lines had been crossed, but we were choosing not to revisit them, at least for now. My husband and I grew closer through the experience, finding a new level of honesty and openness in our relationship. We'd always trusted each other, but this had brought us to an understanding we hadn't had before. Our conversations became more candid, our connection more profound. We spoke about our desires, our curiosities, and even our boundaries in ways we hadn't before. It was as though that night had opened a door, allowing us to explore parts of ourselves we hadn't known existed. We were both more in tune with each other, and I realized that while the experience had been intense, it had ultimately strengthened the foundation of our marriage. Looking back, I understood that the events of that night had been a test, not just of our boundaries, but of our resilience and trust. We had taken a risk, each of us, and while it hadn't been without consequences, it had also allowed us to see each other more fully. There were no secrets between us anymore, no doubts about where we stood. Life returned to its usual rhythm, but the lessons we'd learned stayed with us. My husband's friends remained a part of our lives, though the easy, carefree nature of our gatherings was now tinged with a quiet respect for the lines we had crossed and the limits we had explored. And so we moved forward, changed, yes, but stronger and more connected than before. The memory of that night faded into the background, a reminder of the path we'd chosen and of the depth of our understanding. It was a chapter that had closed, but one that had left its mark, shaping us into something closer, something more honest and real. In the end, we learned that love, trust, and boundaries are constantly evolving, and that sometimes the greatest discoveries come from venturing into the unknown together. And though that night was behind us, it had taught us something we'd carry forever. That together, We were capable of facing anything.